Hey everyone, this is Parath, and this is my in-depth breakdown of the stats for each class and which class to choose if you're looking to min-max your character in Elden Ring. So the way I've kind of approached this is looking solely at stat distributions and not at starting equipment, because very often the starting equipment is super temporary and you're going to be replacing stuff rather quickly and going to stuff that you want your build to focus on, right? So these are all the stat distributions for each class, each one color coded, and in the blue is a comparison to the Wretch class, which serves as a kind of baseline since it starts with 10 in each stat. Now, something to keep in mind is if you would take up all these points and subtract them for each class, you would get the same number, because whereas each class might start at a different level, they all have the same amount of points, just distributed in a different way. And really the caveat to that is the arcane stat, which is almost entirely useless. It's similar to luck from Dark Souls 3, and I'm sure there will be a weapon that scales on this stat, but other than using like a niche weapon like that, you want the least amount of points in arcane as possible. So you can see just off that, like the hero is going to be a very bad class from this kind of a point of view, and calculating these stat distributions, and Vagabond, is very favored because of that. The other stat that I want to mention here is Mind. So in previous games, this stat would dictate how many spell slots you have. So that's how many unique spells you can carry. In Elden Ring, they've changed that. So now it's going to be tied to some kind of item, and so you're going to have to progress through the game to get more spell slots. So Mind only influences your focus points, which is the mana equivalent. So this is another stat that wants to be minimized. However, a lot of in-game spells generally cost a lot of mana, so you are still going to have to put points into this and upgrade your maximum mana. And that kind of leads into my calculations down here, where I'm comparing the starting classes stat distributions to what I would consider an ideal stat distribution. So we'll go through these one by one. So for strength, I have 50 vigor, 50 endurance, 50 strength, and 12 dexterity. And a way I kind of thought about these and put these points is, where do you want to maximize your stats, and then where do we need to minimize? So I think vigor, endurance, and strength kind of speak for themselves for a strength build. 50 is on the higher end for points. And the reason you need 50 vigor and endurance for a strength build is because you're probably going to be slower, so you're going to be taking more hits, which is the vigor. And you're going to need the endurance because you're swinging a bigger weapon, so you're going to be using more stamina. And you're also going to be carrying heavier weapon and armor, so you're going to need the weight increase as well. 50 strength is to maximize our damage, because that's the most important thing, right? 12 is kind of like the baseline I'm using for a minimized stat. So even though we're using strength weapons, there are dex requirements for these weapons, and we need to meet those. And so 12 is kind of like a baseline that I judged based off the weapons from the network test. So you can see here, I have all the points summed up here, and then I subtracted the levels that you have to get to 120, which I am assuming is the meta level, from the amount of points you would have to invest to get this kind of a stat distribution. And then most of the time it's a deficit, but here you can see how many spare points you would have, or what the deficit would be, and how much you would have to minimize your build. So you can see here, Vagabond, you would actually get a spare point. So you could put it into dex if you needed to for a weapon, or put it into strength to get a little bit, squeeze a little more damage into it, and Hero actually gets a deficit. So that's why Vagabond takes the best strength class. Moving on to Dex. Same thing with 50 Vigor. You probably want a high amount of health because you also can manage it with these kind of stat distributions. Strength and Dex is like super like favorable as far as stat distributions go out, because you don't have to put stuff into mind and arcane or like magic based stats. So 50 Vigor, 40 Endurance. You don't need as much endurance because you're going to be wearing light armor, your weapons are lighter, so they cost less stamina. 12 Strength for the same reason that you need 12 Dex up here. 50 Dex for the same reason, you want to maximize your damage. Here's your total points for each class and what your spare would be. So you can see Samurai is the best by a considerable margin, and Bandit is the worst by a considerable margin, which if you actually look up here, Bandit, 14 Arcane, like just awful. Like, don't pick this class, please. Okay, so quality is defined by this 40, 40, 40, 40. Yeah, 4 40s. This stat distribution, and so I kind of compared that to all the melee classes, and just looking over here, we can see that Vagabond and Hero both are pretty even here. Oh, something else to mention. So the way this is calculated, you might see some zeros in here. That just means the stats in that section for the class either meets or exceeds the desired stat. So you'll see those in a lot of these like minimized stats. So just so you know, like if you are under, or sorry, if the starting class is over the minimum stat I have here, that's not a benefit. Like, you don't gain those points back, because whenever you respec, you can only go to what your starting class was. So that's a little caveat there. But back to this quality build. Vagabond and Hero are even here, and that's where I start considering starting equipment. So I think the Vagabond is like far superior starting equipment wise than the Hero, as well as Hero having higher Arcane and then Vagabond having higher Mind. So it's better for like these like quote like waste stats. It's better for that to be in Mind than Arcane, because you do need focus points for weapon skills, Ashes of War. So for Intelligence, where we start getting magic is where the math starts to get a little more complicated. 40-40 Vigor Endurance. I'm using 20 as a baseline for Mind, but this could definitely be lower for meta builds. It just depends how much focus points the in-game spells cost. That's like the big thing. You just want to be able to cast at least one of those in-game spells, especially like buffs, and that's where your Mind stat's going to end. 12 and 12 for the minimum requirements for weapons, and 50 Intelligence because we want to hit that breakpoint for damage. So you can see here that Astrologer ends up taking it by a point, and if you start considering that you might be using a weapon that's lower than these 12 stats, that's where something like this can be a little inaccurate. But since a lot of us are going to go into the game not knowing what weapon we're going to be using, I think 12 is a really good baseline. So I'm recommending Astrologer. But if, like, for future reference, if you know what weapon you're going to use, you can plug in those minimum stats here. The spreadsheet's linked below. You can just plug the numbers in and it will change the stuff and you can see. Alright, so Astrologer for Intelligence for Faith. This is basically the same distribution as Intelligence, except with the 50 in Faith. So Confessor and Prophet actually come out evenly. So again, we're going to look at starting equipment, and Prophet like takes it by like the farthest margin. I think if you are new to Souls games or you're worried about difficulty in the slightest for Elden Ring, choose Prophet. The class is absolutely broken, especially if it's the same balance as the network test. One of the spells, I won't say names or anything, that the Prophet starts with is absolutely beyond broken, and I would be very surprised if they don't nerf it, but I don't think they can nerf it bad enough to the first patch. Like, it's so strong. So very, very much start Prophet. So now we're going to get into hybrid builds, and this is where the math gets really jank. Okay, you might notice starting here we start getting into a lot of deficits for these things. So all these builds you're going to have to minimize, but all these stats that I'm comparing to is like the optimal stuff that you can do, and once you start minimizing, all of these are going to go up towards 0 where you want it, right at the same margin. So these are still accurate. So for intelligence and faith, so this is really for if there's a spell class that's similar to Dark from Dark Souls 2 that scales off both intelligence and faith, which I would be surprised if there isn't, because I think that's a really cool build idea, and you have to be really smart with your stat allocations for these kinds of builds. So you can see that Confessor and Astrologer are both even, and this is where knowing the values for the spells is actually going to be huge, because if it's like Dark Souls 2, they tended to lean more on the intelligence side, those dark spells. So I would, if you're planning on going down this route, I would probably pick Astrologer if you want to be safe, but you can pick either or, and your stats are pretty much going to be even. It's probably worth mentioning as well. This is heavily influenced by the quality build stat allocation with the 4 flex of 40s, and then just your minimum requirements that I'm considering for mind, dex, and strength for magic users. And then this is going to be, and this again, that's going to follow for all these hybrid builds, these 40 like splits between the 4 stats that you're going to want to go into. So faith and strength, you can see here, Prophet takes the cake. Just freaking go Prophet, man. It's such a good class. But you can see like these classes are pretty close, right? Like -15, -15, -14, -14, -8 and 7. I put Wretch in here for these two, just to see how they compared. But Wretch is a really bad starting class too. Don't go that. Faith Dex. So you can see here that Samurai actually takes it here, which isn't a magic starting class. So you will have to find some kind of vendor early, most likely. So you can utilize that, but stat allocation wise, Samurai will be the best for this kind of a build. Intelligence and strength, Astrologer will end up taking it. Again, very, very thin margins. This one's a little bit interesting actually, because you're meeting your stat requirements on a lot of these classes, whereas like the Prisoner, I could actually see being a little potentially better than Astrologer to pick, depending on what the minimum stat requirements for the weapon you're using are. So that's another thing to look into if you're coming back to this video and min-maxing a build where you already know the weapon. Index, real quickly, Prisoner is the best, so and that's why I mentioned that up here. Prisoner has pretty high base stats and strength and dex for a magic user, so I'll be surprised they didn't come out top eventually, right? And then down here, I see like so many people thinking Wretch is a good class, and it's just not. Please don't go Wretch. So this is proof that Wretch sucks, and you can see all these deficits here. Something funny though is that it's actually a better class for a Dex build than Bandit. They really messed up Bandit. I really hope in the final game they reduce this arcane number. If they reduce this arcane number in final build of the game, Bandit might actually be really good. Because it's relatively low level character. So if they just reduce the level by 3 and like bump this arcane down to 11 so it matches hero, it could actually be a really good class to pick. But Bandit will be the class that you pick if you're going to use like a niche weapon that scales off arcane. So that, I guess that is something to keep in mind. So I have a little summary here, but you can look at this all in the document below. Hopefully you enjoyed. Ask any questions below, bring up any discussion. You know, let's be simple, but we can talk about it. Yeah, subscribe, like, comment, all that stuff, and I'll see you guys in Elden Ring.